Hi everybody, I want to take a few minutes to talk to you tonight about stress, which is what our next assignment is going to be about. With stress, there is a cycle. So for this assignment, I've asked you to talk about 3 stress-producing incidents that happen to you, and they can be very simple, from like waiting in traffic to an annoying coworker, or your child is throwing a tantrum because they don't have the latest Apple phone, or it can be something bigger like a car accident. But really, share whatever it is that you're most comfortable in sharing. And that should not be the highlight of your paper. You should really give no more than a paragraph as to what your stress producing incident is that you're discussing. What your assignment needs to focus on is one, stress. So why do these things cause stress for you and maybe not other people? But you're also going to be focusing on the coping strategies, solution-focused coping strategies and emotion-focused coping strategies. That is what your assignment should focus on. So again, you're kind of relating your stress-producing incidents, which should be minimal in your paper, and you're relating them to the content of the text and also what's written, your research. So why do they cause stress? And you can talk very generally about stress overall, because probably the same thing happens within the body and the brain for all of those incidents. Whenever we experience stress, everybody goes through the same thing. So you really want to explain the stress cycle, which I'm going to talk to you about in this video. You also want to show that you have a comprehensive understanding of what those emotion-focused and problem-focused coping strategies are. I also gave you a quick assignment kind of at the beginning of, on the announcements page, on the announcements page, where, what happens to a lot of us, especially as adults, is we don't take time for ourselves. One of the best workshops I ever went to was, talking about, it was using play with traumatized individuals, not just children, but playing with adults and veterans and whatnot, and what are some fun times and how do they make us feel. So one assignment that I've given you is, throughout the week, try to find 5 minutes. Start with just 5 minutes every day to do something fun, to play. And some people are like, oh my goodness, I don't want to sit down and play. Maybe you're reading a book. Maybe you're going out for a walk. Maybe you're going to go sledding with your kids. Not that there's a lot of snow. Or maybe you're going to go play in a pool somewhere. So those are the types of things that you want to think about doing enjoyable. And again, start with 5 minutes. I think everybody can find 5 minutes in their day. So when we talk about stress, when we talk about the stress cycle, the first thing that happens is we have these events. The events themselves do not cause the stress. It is our perception of the event. So what happens is this is why some people can be in little fender benders and be like, well, whatever. And other people, it's a tragedy. Some people are resilient. Some people are not. A lot of what happens with perception has to do with our makeup. It has to do with our development. It also has to do with our personality. So that's ways that you can bring in the past chapters, or why do some people's perception vary from others? We know people who have been in horrific tragedies and they walk away unscathed and they're doing pretty well, while as other people come back and they have a very difficult time after enduring those tragedies. So it really is about the perception. It isn't about the event itself, it's the perception that we're out of control, which then triggers, and we'll go through this in a little more detail, it then triggers our thoughts and our emotions. And then we start this internal dialogue with ourselves. And I think we can all see that. That's a bit Gestalt therapy that we'll be talking in the upcoming weeks. But we have this internal dialogue with ourselves, plus with some of these physiological factors that happen, and we go into fight or flight. And then our brain pretty much does take over the automatic programming response. It brings us into fight or flight. These poor cavemen ran into saber-toothed tigers, and, it was either, ooh, food, or, oh crap, I need to get out of here. And then the brain takes over. So all of this cycle really takes milliseconds. And when we think about the stress cycle, again, it's kind of the perception, but it impacts our sleeping, it impacts our cortisol, it impacts our eating, which all in turns to depression, anxiety, turns into phobias, PTSD. And of course, the cycle keeps going because when we start to not feel well, if we feel our heart palpitate, if we have an upset stomach continually, if we're having muscle soreness, we start to get, oh my goodness, what's wrong with me? That internal dialogue, and we go on with stress. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead because there it is. This is what I'm looking for. Sorry about that. So I just wanted to talk real quick about the brain. So what happens with this is, again, we have a perception of an event and it goes right into our limbic system. It actually triggers what's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is about the size of an almond. It is something that big. It's in the very primitive area of our brain. But what happens is it takes over, and then it sends a message to our adrenal glands. Our adrenal glands are back on the top of our kidneys, so they're kind of in the small of our back. And those adrenal glands say, ah! Because again, we're talking about a very primitive area of the brain. It's not saying, okay, Debbie, you're being ridiculous. You're just watching a movie. This isn't real. Or this is like a glitch in life. It is going to, when we perceive an event as catastrophic, our body is going to react the same, even if it's not. And then it starts to release all the neurotransmitters and all the chemicals into our body, and we have decreased blood flow to the middle organs, like the non-essential organs, like our stomach. Different areas of the brain will start to lose blood flow, and it all goes into the blood flow really goes into the big muscle groups, which is why sometimes that those get tense. That goes into our legs, into our buttocks, into our arms, so that way we can fight or flight. And it goes to very specialized areas of the brain to take over. It also goes into our lungs and into our heart, so it can pump all the oxygen and all of those neurotransmitters throughout the brain, throughout the body. And this cycle happens over and over again. We have heart palpitations, we have shortness of breath. So that's a lot of things that happens in a very short period of time that we really have no control over. Again, it's based on a perception. What happens is as we discussed a few weeks ago, we have this prefrontal and the frontal cortex, which really has to do with our executive functioning. That's a big word now, executive functioning skills, or our learning and our thinking brain. This is the rational area of our brain. So guess what? When we have the limbic system that takes over, the frontal lobe basically stops working. It goes offline. And people cannot access this, which is why they go into this pattern, and we see that they're being what appears to be very irrational, because they're not accessing the rational area of their brain. They're really accessing this very primitive area of the brain, and it really does take over. So what happens when we talk about coping strategies, we have to break the cycle that's happening. We have to break the cycle when the thoughts first come in and start to rationalize over here and access this. So instead of coming from, if we think of the idea out here above the head coming into here and zoop, kind of goes offline and down into our adrenal glands, it never hits the area of the brain to say, this is just a big problem, this is a small problem, this is something you can handle. Again, this is kind of where our personalities come in. So what happens with stress is we're not accessing this area of our brain. And so research has shown, we have a lot of veterans coming back with head injuries and PTSD. This area of the brain becomes very overactive, and the limbic system is very overactive and the frontal lobe is underactive. So that's really a lot of what happens with stress and when we have fight, flight, or freeze. So when we come back up here, this is something that you'll probably want to include in. But we do have a lot of different signs of stress because we see the emotional symptoms that happen. We also have physical symptoms. People talk about gastrointestinal disturbance. Some people get sick to their stomach. Some people have nausea. Some people have constipation. So what happens with the fight or flight, as I just said, the blood flow leaves non-essential organs, which is the stomach. So it's going to do your kind of stomach and intestines are going to do one of two things. One, it's either going to get rid of everything because it can't process the food, the diarrhea, or it's going to basically stop working and hold everything in, which is the constipation, and it could also lead to nausea. So, sometimes people are like, oh, I ate something, oh, I didn't think about, some people have to urinate more when they're under a lot of stress. We also have behavioral symptoms that happen. People sleep or eat more. Sometimes they withdraw. Sometimes we hear about those irrational, so nervous habits that go on. This is also where people might start to abuse drugs or alcohol. But there's also cognitive symptoms, and this happens too. I think we've all been stressed where we can't remember anything, and somebody tells us something and we can't remember it, or what did you just say? Constant worry and nervousness. So those are different signs of stress. And then really we're going to talk a little bit about this too. When we talk about the stress cycle, it really impacts us overall. Diseases will happen because of stress. There's been a lot of research out there that shows that high levels of stress can impact how we feel. There's research out there about cancer and how cancer reacts to people who are stressed. Recovering from surgery, a lot of times bills say, you need to go home and rest and do nothing because you really need to allow your body to heal. When you aren't sleeping, when you aren't eating well, your body's not healing. So when we think about that, we have that tension, that muscle contractions that we just talked about with the fight, flight, or freeze. Our brain kind of takes over and increases certain areas, but our circulation overall starts to diminish. Again, the circulation is going to those major muscle areas in order for them to work and do what they're supposed to from the caveman days. Our body and our brain, as much as we know about it, is still going to react the same way as it did millions of years ago. At which point our cortisol levels increase, and we're going to talk about cortisol a little bit more because at that point we also have toxins in our body that decrease. We have high levels of CO2. Waste is not being eliminated as effectively as it should be. Our liver and our pancreas and our kidneys are not working as they should be. At which point this is where pain starts to come in, weakened immune systems start to come in, and then overall health issues develop. Some of these are sometimes minor health issues, and sometimes they could be major. We've all experienced kind of some prolonged stress at some point in our life, and we don't feel well. Maybe we get headaches. Maybe you end up getting colds. But if you really understand the stress cycle to take care of yourself and use coping strategies, hopefully you can alleviate especially these three areas over here. These three areas are really kind of those big triggers that happens that leads to health issues. So again, cortisol, as I said, cortisol is very helpful, but cortisol is a big word, and that's something you could definitely research as part of your research for this. But cortisol will increase blood sugar, which is going to impact how we eat and suppress the immune system. Decrease serotonin, so we're not actually as happy as we could be. It's also going to decrease our sensitivity to pain. Over here, people are thinking, oh, heightened memory and attention, that's a good thing. In a way, yes, it is, but then these people begin to hyper-focus on things. And this is where you see people paying very close attention to things that they do, double checking, all of a sudden, this is where people kind of start going on the internet, start researching things very thoroughly because of stress. So heightened memory and attention, a lot of these can be very good. But when we have an overload of cortisol, as you can see, there's some positive things here. but there's more negative things too. These things you do have to be careful because even though they're positive, if cortisol keeps increasing in your body, these don't start to work for our benefit. So again, stress, we have a we have a response in our brain. The adrenal glands are the ones that produce that cortisol. And it really leads to adrenal exhaustion and low cortisol overall. And there's a lot about adrenal fatigue. I look online and people are talking about, I can't remember the word, but something about the adrenal glands not working. There's now like a kind of like a diagnosis, for lack of a better word, but adrenal fatigue is a lot of what they go. And then really you start to not be able to respond to stress as you once were able to. So this kind of goes through a little bit about more specifically as what I've been talking about. So when we think about when we perceive a threat, and that's a big piece there, the perception, we have muscles and the jaw tighten to prevent the lower jaw from being ripped off in trauma. Because really, what do animals go through? And if we don't have the lower jaw, we can't chew food. Food's our survival. But this is what our brain is really thinking. The pancreas begins a rapid burn of sugar in the blood. That's quick energy. But again, if we're living in this long term, the pancreas isn't going to be working as effectively because the digestive system shuts down. And this is where we can have the constipation. This is where we have stomach aches. Children very often, if anybody has children, they're like, oh, I have a belly ache. And all of a sudden we find out they had a big math test or a big spelling test come up. They're having problems with friends. A lot of times they will talk about stomach aches. The reproductive system increases in activity because that's a survival instinct and we want to be able to reproduce. The fascia, the covering of the muscles, tightens to protect the muscles. The sacrum tucks in so it can cover the brain and the spinal cord, especially at the bottom here. Another reason why we have constipation is because everything up here tightens up. Those adrenal glands produce that adrenaline and other neurotransmitters. And then we have the muscles in the back. A lot of people like it's the posture, it's this, it's that. We have to understand that the muscles in the back tighten around the spinal cord in order to protect it. Because if basically from here down, if any of this gets injured, if you think along this back side, if any of that gets injured, we are going to be in a weakened state and subject to being killed. If we think about, millions of years ago. So a lot of times we have those headaches, those neck aches, those back aches. Our muscles are tight, not because we're not relaxing, but because of the perception of stress. And basically our body has taken over to protect ourselves. So when we talk about those coping strategies, and this is where some of our past assignments will come into play. So we have the environment, which is full of stressors. It's stressors all the time. We have stressors at work, we have stressors at school, we have stressors at home, we have stressors in the community. They're all over the place. And they come in, and this is where our filter comes in. Again, part of development has to do with it. Part of people's personality has to do with it. If you, kind of the genetic makeup also has to do with it. How many women in college, never walk around at dark at night? Thinking of high school, I was always outside at night. I grew up at a time where, we played outside. Now as an adult, I'm hyper-focused. I'm hypersensitive when I'm walking by myself, and I do things to protect myself because in college it was like, don't walk by yourself because you're going to be attacked and raped and left for, whatever. That was basically what was put into my mind again and again and again. It was a dangerous, perception that, oh my goodness, I'm now walking around alone. There are safety factors. There's definitely safety factors that, yes, I should be more alert when I'm walking around. Taking women's self-defense courses, yes, you're going to be outside. You're going to be by yourself. Whether it's at night or in the daylight, how are you aware of your surroundings? So that way it is a dangerous, but how do I perceive the threat and how do I protect myself? Um, but then the stresses of, oh, I've got this project coming up. So, you know what? I'm going to do some things in order to, this is a big project. I want to get a good grade on it. I have the psychology project due towards the end of April. So I'm going to work for 1 hour once a week researching my topic of anxiety. So you've made it into a positive appraisal of the event. So when the perception comes in, when the stimuli comes in and it's been perceived by the person and it's perceived as dangerous, so it's a threat, there's going to be harm, there's going to be loss, this may be grieving, we have what's called the secondary appraisal. So then we analyze, do we have resources? If we feel we have sufficient resources, if there are people who support us, if we have the means to take care of it, it doesn't mean that the stress is going away, but okay, this is something I can deal with. Sometimes we talk with kids of this is this a glitch? Is this a small problem or is this a big problem? Sometimes thinking of it that way, that, this is a glitch. This is something, just a bump in the road that I need to get through. Oh, I didn't get a good grade on a paper, so what am I going to do? Oh, I'm going to talk to my advisor, I'm going to talk to the teacher, I'm going to make sure my paper's proofread. You have sufficient resources. On the other hand, if you feel that you don't have the sufficient resources, that is when stress comes in. So there is quite a bit of processing, and it's not really active processing for many, many people, which is part of the problem, which in therapy, you want to start being actively involved in the processing before the perceptions become into stress. So when we have stress, we have coping mechanisms, and this is the way we deal with the stress. So do we want to change the situation itself, which is problem focused, or do we change the relation to the situation, which is that emotion focused? And then what's supposed to happen, which does not always happen, is we should, take a look back. Did this work? Didn't this not work? And what do I need to do differently? Whether it be the coping strategies or maybe even back up here when we talk about our perception overall. And I'm sorry that this did not come out. Maybe make this a little smaller. But when we think about our coping strategies, we have problem focused. We want to analyze the reasons why errors were made and how to correct them. And, but there's also avoidance where, well, we're just going to try again and not really worry about it. Emotion focused, where we're using relaxation techniques to reduce stress. Where, what are some things that we're doing to improve our mood? What are we doing to analyze that perception? Avoidance would be, you're ignoring the situation. It didn't bother me. It's irrelevant. So those are kind of those coping styles and examples of the behaviors that occur with these different coping strategies. And there's lots and lots of information out there about these two strategies, so you can show that you have a comprehensive understanding of these concepts. So that is a bit about stress. I think you can see that stress will be leading into our upcoming chapters of, and this is a big piece for our for your project, your multimedia project, because when does the mental health disorder become abnormal? And going back to, let me get to the right one here. Sorry, it was just this one. Going back to here, that perception, and then these appraisals. This is the area that will come into play when we talk about, anxiety, depression, a lot of those disorders of where's the breakdown in here that's occurring from stress. So if you guys have any questions, definitely feel free to email me and I will get back to you. So you guys have a great week. Thank you. Bye.